They sharpened the sword before they even finished reading the charges. That was the part nobody ever told you about a royal trial. The executioner is already testing the blade's edge on his thumb while the accuser is still speaking. Seraphine Ashworth stood in the center of the throne room in a gown stained with someone else's blood, listening to a king she had trusted since childhood call her a poisoner, a traitor, a monster who did not deserve the mercy of a clean death. The man she was supposed to marry would not even look at her. The girl she had called her sister since they were 7 years old stood behind the throne, dabbing false tears with a silk handkerchief, and smiled, just once, just for Seraphine, just enough. Exile, the king announced, not execution, because apparently that was mercy. Beyond the border into the forsaken wastes where nothing lived past the first winter. They wanted her to die slowly, quietly, somewhere the court would never have to look at what they had done. What none of them knew, what not even Seraphine knew yet, was that the wastes were called forsaken for a reason no living person remembered. Something old was sleeping out there. Something that had been waiting 300 years for someone broken enough and stubborn enough to wake it up. The throne room smelled like candle wax and fear, and Seraphine had learned over 19 years as a duke's daughter that both scents meant someone important was about to lie. Lady Seraphine Ashworth. King Aldrich Draymore's voice cracked slightly on her name, the first honest thing he had done all evening. You stand accused of poisoning Her Majesty Queen Rosalind with essence of nightbell, administered through the ceremonial wine at the spring accord banquet. I did not do this. Seraphine's voice did not shake. She had promised herself it would not shake. I loved the queen. She taught me to read star charts when I was 11 years old. A ripple of murmurs. Somewhere in the gallery, her father's face had gone the color of old parchment. Duke Reynard Ashworth did not speak in the king's court unless invited, and tonight he had not been invited. The physicians found the residue in a vial. The king's advisor, Magistrate Oren Vex, stepped forward with the theatrical solemnity of a man who enjoyed being the one holding the evidence. Bearing your household seal, my lady, hidden in your own chambers. Then someone put it there. Seraphine turned, searching the gallery for one face, the only face she still believed might defend her. Callum, tell them I was with you in the East Garden when the wine was poured, you know I couldn't have. Prince Callum Draymore, her betrothed of 4 years, the boy who had once climbed the Ashworth orchard wall to bring her stolen peaches when she was grounded for dueling practice, looked at the floor. I was not with the Lady Ashworth that evening, he said quietly. I have no knowledge of her whereabouts. The room did not gasp. Courts rarely gasp, they simply go still the way a forest goes still before a storm, everyone already knowing what is about to happen and choosing collectively to let it. Seraphine felt something inside her chest crack cleanly in half, the way a dropped teacup cracks, not shattering, just splitting along a line that had always secretly been there. Then you're lying, she said, and her voice finally did shake just once. You know I was with you. You kissed my hand at the edge of the fountain and told me you'd never let anything touch me again. Callum's jaw tightened, he still did not look up. It was Lady Iris Hallow who spoke next, stepping forward from behind the throne with the queen's own handkerchief pressed delicately to dry eyes that had produced, Seraphine noted with a strange, floating detachment, not a single actual tear. Iris had been her closest friend since they were both 7 years old, learning embroidery in the same nursery, sharing the same tutors, the same secrets, the same childhood promise carved into an oak tree behind the Ashworth stables. Sisters before crowns. Seraphine, Iris said, and her voice trembled beautifully the way a trained singer's voice trembles on the final note of a tragic ballad. I didn't want to say anything, I kept hoping it wasn't true. But I saw you that night near the kitchens with a vial just like the one they found. That's not possible. Seraphine's hands had begun to shake now, badly, visibly. And she hated herself for it because she knew, some cold, clear part of her already knew, that trembling hands looked exactly like guilt to people who had already decided what they wanted to see. Iris, look at me, you know me, you've known me 12 years, why would you say this? Iris did look at her then. And for exactly 1/2 of 1 second, before the tears returned and the tremor came back into her voice, something flickered across her face that was not grief at all. It was satisfaction. Seraphine saw it. Nobody else did, because nobody else was looking at Iris the way you look at someone you have loved your entire life, searching for the person you knew inside the stranger currently destroying you. She's lying, Seraphine said, quieter now, almost to herself. She's actually lying, and everyone here is going to let her. King Aldrich had heard enough. He rose from the throne, and the finality in the movement silenced the last murmurs in the gallery. Seraphine Ashworth, for the crime of attempted regicide against Her Majesty Queen Rosalind, this court sentences you to exile beyond the eastern border into the Forsaken Wastes, to be enforced within 3 days' time, stripped of title, land, and name. Let it be known that the crown shows mercy this night in choosing banishment over the blade. Mercy, Seraphine almost laughed. She had heard once from an old groundskeeper who'd served 3 kings. What actually lived in the Forsaken Wastes, nothing, was the answer, nothing at all, because nothing could survive there past the first snowfall. They were not sparing her life. They were simply outsourcing her death to a landscape that would not require witnesses. She looked one last time at Callum. He still would not meet her eyes. She looked at Iris, who had finally stopped performing grief and now wore an expression of quiet, contented calm, like a cat settling into a warmed patch of sunlight. "You planned this," Seraphine said to both of them, to the whole glittering, rotten room. "Both of you, for how long?" Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. The guards were already moving toward her, and as they took her by the arms, Seraphine Ashworth did something that would be whispered about in that court for years afterward, long after they assumed she was dead. She smiled. It was small. And it was cold, and it did not reach her eyes, and later, much later, Iris Hallow would wake in the night remembering that exact smile and wonder. For the first time, if she had made a mistake, she would spend the rest of her life paying for. 3 days later, Seraphine Ashworth walked past the eastern border stone with a single traveling cloak. No coin, no name, and no expectation of surviving the season. What she did not know, what nobody in that gilded, treacherous throne room had ever bothered to learn, was that 300 years ago, an empire far older and far more powerful than the Draymore crown had buried something in those wastes on purpose. Not as a grave. As a vault, and vaults, unlike people, only ever open for the right kind of key. The first week in the Forsaken Wastes taught Seraphine 3 things. That royal gowns are useless against wind that cuts like knives, that hunger has a sound, a low, hollow ringing in the ears, and that grief, when you cannot afford to indulge it, simply waits. She had traded the gown for a dead trapper's coat on the second day, found half buried near a frozen creek, and tried very hard not to think about how the trapper had died. She had learned to eat frost-lichened scraped from black stone, bitter enough to make her gag but rich enough to keep her upright. She had walked 12, sometimes 15 miles a day with no destination beyond away from the border. Because staying near it meant staying near the temptation to crawl back and beg, and Seraphine Ashworth had decided somewhere around the 4th night, shivering under an overhang of dead pine, that she would rather die out here as herself than live one more hour as someone who begged Iris Hallow for anything. It was on the 9th day that she found the ruins. They should not have existed. Every map of the waste she had ever seen in her father's library, and she had seen many because her father had once been foolishly proud of a daughter who read supply line maps for fun, showed nothing east of the border stone but empty gray nothing. 300 miles of nothing until the coastline. But there, half swallowed by a dune of black volcanic sand that had no business existing in a place this cold, stood the broken spine of what had once been an enormous structure. Towers snapped off at odd angles like the stems of dead flowers. A gate, 12 times her height, hanging crookedly from a single remaining hinge the size of a cartwheel. Seraphine stood at the threshold for a long time before she went in, mostly because going in required accepting that she had nothing left to lose. And there was a strange, quiet grief in admitting that out loud, even just to herself. "Well," she said to the wind, because there was no one else to say it to, "if something in there kills me, at least it'll be faster than the cold." The inside of the ruin was warmer than it had any right to be. That was the first sign something was wrong, or right, depending, she would later decide, on how you defined either word. The corridors were carved with symbols she did not recognize, spirals within spirals, and here and there. Veins of pale blue crystal ran through the black stone like frozen lightning, humming faintly. When she pressed her palm against them, a vibration she felt in her teeth before she heard it in her ears. She found the chamber on the 4th day of exploring. She had taken to sleeping inside the ruins' outer halls since they were warmer and drier than anything the open waste offered. A vast circular room, its domed ceiling cracked open to a slice of gray sky. And at its center, rising from the floor like a frozen wave, an enormous formation of the same pale blue crystal, easily 3 times her height, and inside it unmistakably a shape. Not a statue. A shape that had once breathed. "That is either the best or the worst thing I have ever found," Seraphine said aloud, and her voice echoed back at her 7 times, each echo slightly deeper than the last, until the final one did not sound like her voice at all. "I have been asleep for 312 years, said the final echo, and Seraphine Ashworth, who had stood in a throne room, and been condemned by the 2 people she loved most in the world without so much as flinching, screamed loudly enough to knock a chunk of loose stone from the cracked ceiling. You can talk," she said, once she had stopped screaming, backing toward the chamber's entrance with her heart trying to escape through her ribs. "You're talking, you're a crystal." Talking crystals are not a thing that is supposed to happen to me on top of everything else that has happened to me this month. What is this month you speak of, said the voice, and there was something in it, amusement Seraphine realized slowly. The crystal sounded amused. That felt oddly dangerously familiar the way a very old, very dangerous dog might sound amused watching a new puppy work up the courage to approach. I was exiled, Seraphine said, because apparently she had decided to simply answer questions from an ancient talking crystal in a dead ruin, which was, she reflected, probably not the response a sane person would choose, but she had not felt entirely sane since the trial. Framed for poisoning a queen I loved by my best friend so that my fiancé could marry her instead, and the king let it happen because it was politically convenient, and now I am going to die out here in the cold because apparently that counts as mercy. The crystal was silent for a long moment, long enough that Seraphine wondered if she had somehow bored an ancient being into permanent silence, which would have been, she thought, a genuinely impressive final achievement. You have been betrayed, said the voice finally, and it had changed, quieter now, less booming, almost gentle. As was I 300 years ago, my own generals sealed me into this stone rather than share the power I had built for them. I have had 300 years to consider what I would do, given a second chance. Seraphine took a slow step closer to the crystal, curiosity beginning to override the very reasonable fear still hammering through her chest. What are you? I was Villainess, archmage of the EMBRFLL Empire, last of the DRAGUNBLODD SPLLWAVRS, said the voice, and this time there was no mistaking the pride buried under 3 centuries of dust. And I have been waiting, Seraphine ASHWRTH, for someone exactly like you. You know my name. I have known your name since you crossed the outer threshold, said Vaelith. This place does not awaken for just anyone. It awakens for those who have been broken and have not yet decided to stay broken. Tell me, child, do you wish simply to survive the winter? Or do you wish one day to walk back into that throne room and make every person who condemned you regret it? Seraphine Ashworth thought of Callum's downturned eyes. She thought of Iris's half-second flicker of satisfaction, disguised behind a stolen handkerchief. She thought of the king calling banishment mercy, as if freezing to death slowly were somehow a kindness compared to a clean blade. Both, she said. I want both. The crystal cracked, not shattering but splitting along a single clean seam top to bottom. Exactly the way something inside Seraphine's own chest had cracked 3 days before this in a throne room 300 miles away, and light pale blue and impossibly old poured out into the broken dome above them like dawn arriving 3 hours early. Then let us begin, said Vaelith. Your training will not be gentle. But I promise you this, Seraphine ASHWRTH, by the time I am finished with you, the world will have forgotten that a girl named Seraphine ever knelt before that throne at all. Seraphine did not know, standing there in the crystal light with frost still crusted in her hair, that the price of Vaelith's power was not paid in gold, or in blood, or in years. It was paid in something far more specific, far more dangerous, and far closer to home than she could possibly have imagined. Vaelith's voice, it turned out, could be genuinely unbearable at 6 in the morning. Breathe from the chest, not the throat. The throat is for singing. The chest is for surviving. The ancient archmage boomed across the ruin's central chamber while Seraphine, 3 weeks into what she had started privately calling her apprenticeship, though Vaelith insisted the correct term was ascension trial, lay flat on her back on the cold stone floor. Having just been knocked there by a blast of raw arcane feedback that felt like being struck by a very polite, very deliberate wall. I am breathing from my chest, Seraphine wheezed. My chest currently feels like it has been sat on by a horse. That is the feedback of untrained magic meeting a channel too narrow to hold it, said Vaelith, and though the archmage no longer lived inside solid crystal, he had over the past weeks learned to project a shifting translucent form roughly man-shaped. Wreathed faintly in the same pale blue light that ran through the ruin's veins, his voice had not lost its tendency to sound like distant satisfied thunder. Your body is a vessel, child. Right now you are a teacup trying to hold a river. We will fix this. It will hurt, it will continue to hurt for some time. This is regrettably how all worthwhile things work. You're a very comforting mentor, Seraphine muttered, hauling herself upright. I am an accurate one, said Vaelith. There is a difference, and you will learn to prefer mine. The weeks that followed blurred together in a rhythm Seraphine had never experienced in her old life, where every day at the Ashworth estate had been shaped by etiquette masters and dance instructors, and the polite, suffocating expectation that a duke's daughter existed primarily to be admired. Out here, admiration meant nothing. Out here, the only currency was whether you could still stand at the end of the day. She learned to draw heat from the crystal veins in the walls and shape it into a blade of pure light thin as a needle. Sharp enough to split falling snow before it hit the ground. A party trick Vaelith called it dismissively, but one that took her 11 days of failure, and one badly singed eyebrow to manage even once. She learned to read the old Emberfall glyphs carved into the ruin's deeper chambers, discovering, to her genuine surprise, that she had a gift for languages nobody at court had ever bothered to test, because languages were not considered a useful skill for a future princess. "You keep saying I have a gift for things," she said one evening, sitting near a crystal vein that pulsed warm light like a slow heartbeat, sharing the last of a rabbit she had finally learned to hunt with a snare Vaelith had taught her to set. But nobody at court ever noticed any of this. 19 years and not one tutor ever said, perhaps let the girl study war magic instead of watercolor painting. "Because they did not want you capable," said Vaelith, and his projected form dimmed slightly, the closest approximation Seraphine had learned to recognize as something like sorrow. A capable Duchess asks questions. A capable Duchess notices when her betrothed spends suspicious amounts of time with her supposed best friend. "They did not raise you to be weak by accident," Seraphine Ashworth. "They raised you to be weak on purpose, because a weak woman is easier to blame." Seraphine sat with that for a long moment, turning it over the way she had learned to turn over arcane theory, examining every angle before she let herself believe it. "That's the same thing you keep saying about power," she said finally. "That it isn't given, it's taken back." "Precisely," said Vaelith, and there was real warmth in it now, warmth that Seraphine, despite herself, despite 3 centuries separating them, despite the fact that her teacher was technically a disembodied ghost bound to a pile of ancient crystal, had come to genuinely treasure. Now, again. And this time, do not let the river drown the cup become the river. It was on the 51st day, Seraphine had started keeping count-scratching lines into the stone near her sleeping alcove. Because counting the days was the only way she kept the trial's timeless blur from swallowing her whole, that she finally held the crystal veins, full power, without breaking a column of pale blue light roaring up through the cracked dome and into the gray sky above visible. Vaelith noted with something like pride for perhaps 40 miles in every direction. She stood in the center of it, arms outstretched, hair whipping around her face, and for the first time since the trial, since Callum's downturned eyes and Iris's half-second smile, Seraphine Ashworth laughed, a real laugh, loud and surprised and entirely her own. "I did it," she said, breathless. "Vaelith, I actually did it." "You did," said Vaelith, and then quieter, almost reluctant, "which means it is time I told you the part of this bargain I have been delaying." The light around her flickered, and Seraphine's stomach dropped in the particular way it had learned to drop whenever something important was about to go wrong. "What part?" "Power of this magnitude does not come free, child," said Vaelith. "The EMBRFALL Empire fell because its SPELLWAVRS forgot this. Every ascension requires a price paid in kind, not gold, not blood, but memory. Each time you draw deeply from this well, you will lose something, a small thing at first. A name, a face, the sound of someone's laugh. It will not kill you. But it will cost you, and I would rather you know this now, before you are standing in that throne room wondering why you cannot remember why you hated the people standing in front of you." Seraphine's laughter died in her throat. "You're telling me now, after 51 days. "I am telling you now because now is when you are strong enough to hear it without breaking," said Vaelith, and for the first time his ancient voice carried something that sounded almost like guilt. "The choice is still yours, Seraphine. You can stop here. You have enough power now to survive the wastes, to build a life far from that court, to let them all simply forget you existed. Or you can continue, and risk losing pieces of yourself with every step closer to the revenge you want." Seraphine looked up at the column of light, still roaring silently above her, thought of Iris's stolen tears, of Callum's downturned eyes, of a king who had called slow death by exposure an act of mercy, and thought, too, of the version of herself who might one day forget why any of it had mattered at all. "What's the alternative?" she said finally. "Staying weak, staying forgotten, and letting them keep their happy ending? No, I'll pay it, whatever it costs. I want them to look at me and understand finally exactly what they made." Vaelith's light flared, bright and fierce, and underneath it unmistakably proud. "Then let us begin the second trial," said the archmage. "This one will not be about strength. This one will be about what you are willing to lose to keep it." Neither of them noticed in that moment the second column of light, thinner, colder, and 30 miles further east, rising in silent answer from somewhere deep in the wastes that Vaelith had assured her, with absolute confidence, contained nothing at all. The second light appeared 3 nights later, and it was Vaelith, not Seraphine, who saw it first. That is not possible, the archmage said, his projected form snapping suddenly rigid, all the warm amusement gone from his voice in an instant. That signature. I felt that signature in 300 years. Seraphine, who had been practicing the fine control of her light blade on a length of dead pine, looked up sharply. Vaelith, what signature? My general, said Vaelith, and the word came out of him like something bitter finally spat free after centuries of swallowing it. Moraine Vesk, the man who sealed me into that crystal, he should have died with the Empire. He should have died 300 years ago. But he didn't, Seraphine said slowly, watching the thin, cold light on the eastern horizon. No, said Vaelith. It seems like he found his own vault. And it seems someone has recently given him reason to wake. It took Seraphine only a moment to understand what he meant, and when she did, ice ran through her that had nothing to do with the waste's endless winter. The king, someone at court found out about this place, about you. I do not know, said Vaelith. But I know this, Moraine Vesk does not wake for nothing. He only ever moved when there was a throne to be taken. And he never moved alone. They did not sleep that night. Instead, Vaelith told her, finally, the full history he had spent 51 days carefully editing. The Emberfall Empire had not simply fallen to war, as every surviving fragment of history claimed. It had fallen because Vaelith's own inner circle, led by his most trusted general, had grown terrified of the power he was building. Power meant, Vaelith insisted with quiet fury, to protect the Empire's borders from an invasion that never came. Rather than trust him, rather than question him, they had sealed him away and quietly rewrote the Empire's history to erase him from it entirely, ruling in his name for a generation before the Empire finally collapsed under its own corruption anyway. So he did the same thing to you that Iris did to me, Seraphine said quietly, convinced everyone you were the danger so nobody would question what he was actually planning. Betrayal is rarely original, said Vaelith. It only ever wears new faces. Which is why, Seraphine Ashworth, I need you to understand something before we go any further. If Moraine Vesk is awake, he will not simply reclaim what he stole from me. He will look for a throne to claim in its place. And the nearest throne, the only one worth taking in 300 miles, belongs to the very king who exiled you. Seraphine felt something cold and clear settle into place in her chest, not fear exactly, though there was fear in it. Clarity. Then we have a common problem, she said, and possibly terribly a common enemy. Do not mistake a shared enemy for a shared cause, Vaelith warned. Moraine Vesk will not hesitate to use you, Seraphine, the same way he used every other asset in his long, patient life. He is persuasive, he is patient, and he will know exactly what to offer a girl who has been betrayed by everyone she ever loved, revenge handed to her, no price attached. There's always a price attached, Seraphine said. You taught me that yourself. Vaelith's light warmed just slightly. Good. Then you are already wiser than most of my old generals ever managed to be. It was 4 days later that they encountered the first of Vaelith's old enemies in person, not Moraine Vesk himself, but a scouting party of what Vaelith called Hollow Knight's soldiers who had died serving the old empire, and been bound through a corruption of the very magic Vaelith had once wielded into something that no longer needed to breathe, eat, or feel fear. Seraphine felt them before she saw them, a wrongness in the crystal veins running through the ruins' outer halls like a held breath gone rotten. How many? She whispered, pressing herself flat against a broken pillar. 3, said Vaelith. Hollow Knights do not negotiate, Seraphine. They do not tire. They do not feel the cold you and I have been fighting for 70 days. This will be your first trial by blood, not by theory. Are you ready? Seraphine thought of the throne room, of trembling hands that had looked like guilt to a court that had already decided what it wanted to see. She thought of 70 days of frost lichen and light blades, and a mentor's thunderous, unwavering belief that she could become something the world had never bothered to imagine she was capable of being. I'm not the girl who stood in that throne room anymore, she said, and drew the light into her palm, watching it sharpen into a blade brighter and steadier than it had ever been. Let's find out what I actually am. The first Hollow Knight rounded the broken pillar a heartbeat later, its armor rusted black, its helm empty save for 2 points of cold blue light where eyes had once been, and Seraphine Ashworth, exiled Duchess, condemned traitor, apprentice to a 300-year-old archmage, did not run. For the first time in her life, she was the one something else had to be afraid of. The Hollow Knight moved faster than its rusted armor suggested it should, and Seraphine's first strike went wide, her light blade skidding off an ancient breastplate with a shriek of sparks that lit the corridor in flashes of white and blue. Do not meet it head-on, Vaelith's voice cut through her focus, urgent now, all trace of amusement gone. It has no fear to exploit, it has no pain to punish. It only has momentum. Break its footing, not its armor. Seraphine ducked beneath a swing that would have taken her head from her shoulders, felt the wind of it disturb her hair, and understood in the split second before the second hollow knight rounded the pillar behind her. That Veilith's lessons about breathing from the chest and becoming the river had never really been about magic at all. They had been about this, the precise, terrible clarity required to survive. She dropped low, drove her light blade not at the knight's chest, but at the brittle leather straps binding its ancient greaves, and felt them part like old parchment. The hollow knight staggered, its momentum betraying it exactly as Veilith had promised, and Seraphine was already moving past it, already turning her attention to the second, when the third came at her from the corridor's darkened mouth, faster than the others, its blade already swinging for her exposed side. She felt the strike land before she understood what had happened. Not the blade itself, which Veilith's projected form had somehow impossibly intercepted with a burst of raw arcane force that cost him visibly. His light flickering thin and pale for several long seconds afterward, but the shock of it, the realization that she had for one crucial half-second actually believed she might die. "Veilith, I am fine," the archmage said, though his voice had thinned considerably. "Focus. The third one is wounded now. Finish this." Seraphine turned on the third knight with something that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but a fusion of both sharper and colder than either alone, and drove her light blade through the gap where the creature's helm met its collar. Into whatever passed in a hollow night for the place a soul might once have lived. The creature convulsed once, twice, and then simply stopped, its rusted armor collapsing inward like a puppet whose strings had all been cut at once. The corridor went silent except for her own ragged breathing and the low, exhausted hum of Veilith's light steadying itself against the wall. "That's one," she said, once she trusted her voice not to shake. "Where are the other two?" "Fled," said Veilith. "They will report back to whoever sent them." "Which means, Seraphine, that Moraine Vesk now KNOWS someone is awake in this ruin, and he will want to know WHO." Seraphine sat down heavily against the broken pillar, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed, not from fear, she realized slowly, but from something closer to exhilaration, the strange, giddy aftermath of having survived something that should by every reasonable measure have killed her. "I killed something," she said quietly. "An hour ago I was practicing on dead pine and now I've killed something." "It was already dead," said Veilith gently. "You freed whatever was left of the soul trapped inside that armor. That is not the same thing as taking a life, and you should not carry it as THOUGH it were." "It still felt the same," Seraphine admitted. "In the moment, it felt exactly the same." Veilith was quiet for a long moment, his light pulsing slow and steady against the corridor wall. "That is because you have a conscience," he said finally. "Moraine Vesk lost his 300 years ago if he ever had one at all. The fact that this frightens you, Seraphine, is not a weakness. It is the one thing that will keep you from becoming HIM, no matter how much power you eventually wield." They rested 3 days after that in the ruin's innermost chamber, where the crystal veins ran thickest and Veilith's projected form could regenerate its strength most quickly. It was during this rest that Seraphine first noticed the gap. "Veilith," she said slowly, staring at her own hands. "What was my mother's name?" The silence that followed told her everything before he spoke. "I do not know," Seraphine said Veilith quietly. "That is not a question I can answer for you." "I should know that," Seraphine said, and her voice had gone strange, flat, frightened in a way the Hollow Knights had not managed to frighten her. I know I had a mother. I know she died when I was young. But I can't see her face anymore. I can't remember her name." "The price," said Veilith, and there was real grief in his voice now, old and deep and entirely genuine. "This is what I warned you of. The power you drew 3 days ago, to survive that fight, it took its payment." Seraphine sat with the hollow space where her mother's name should have been, testing it the way a tongue tests the gap left by a missing tooth, and felt something in her harden that had nothing to do with magic at all. "Then I'll make sure it's worth it," she said finally, her voice steady again. "I'll make sure that when I walk back into that throne room, every single thing I've lost getting there was worth exactly what it cost." She did not yet know that the price would not stop at names and faces. She did not yet know that somewhere in the deepest, oldest part of the ruin, Moraine Vesk had just begun rebuilding an army that had been waiting 300 years for a throne worth taking, and that the girl he needed most to either recruit or destroy was sitting at that very moment 30 miles to the west, learning to grieve a mother she could no longer remember. Moraine Vesk had not aged a single day in 300 years, and he found this, if he were being entirely honest with himself, the single most tedious part of eternal preservation. He stood in the ruin of his own making, smaller than Valeth's vault colder, built with the deliberate austerity of a man who had never trusted comfort not to make him soft, and studied the report given to him by the two surviving Hollow Knights with the patient. Unhurried attention of someone who had learned centuries ago that rushing decisions was how empires actually fell. A girl, he said finally, his voice dry as old paper, entirely unlike the thunderous grandeur of the archmage he had once served and then betrayed. Valeth has chosen a girl. The Hollow Knights, of course, did not answer. They did not need to. Moraine had learned long ago that the correct response to most information was simply to think carefully until the correct action revealed itself. He had sealed Valeth away for a reason that history, the history Moraine himself had carefully rewritten in the decades following the seal, remembered as treachery, but which Moraine had always privately understood as the only sane response available to him. Valeth had been building power beyond any single mortal's right to hold power, that answered to nothing, but Valeth's own conviction that he alone could be trusted with it, and Moraine, who had watched enough kings and generals throughout his long life make exactly that same claim before ruining everything they touched, had simply refused to wait and see if this particular archmage would be the exception. He did not regret the seal. He regretted, if anything, that it had taken 300 years for someone foolish enough, or perhaps simply desperate enough, to break it. Send word to the Draymore court, he told the empty air, and somewhere in the ruins' deeper chambers, another Hollow Knight stirred to obey. Because Moraine Vesk had learned, over 3 centuries, precisely which strings in that court's tapestry were worth quietly pulling. Tell them their exiled Duchess is not dead. Tell them she has found something in the wastes that should concern them a great deal more than a poisoned queen ever did. He paused, considering, the way he considered everything, slowly and without haste. And tell them, he added, that I am willing to help them deal with it, for an appropriate price. It took the Hollow Knight 9 days to reach the border and deliver its message through channels Moraine had spent 3 centuries quietly maintaining. A corrupt border warden here, a magistrate's clerk with expensive debts there, the patient architecture of influence that outlasts kingdoms because it never announces itself. By the time the message reached King Aldrich Draymore, it had been shaped subtly into precisely the story Moraine Vesk wanted told. Aldrich received the news in his private study, not the throne room, with only Magistrate Vex and notably Lady Iris Hallow present, Iris having, in the 4 months since Seraphine's exile, made herself indispensable to a king who found her tearful loyalty far more comforting than his own son's evident guilt over the entire affair. Alive, Aldrich repeated, staring at the sealed missive Vex had just read aloud. She's alive, and she's found what exactly? Some kind of weapon. A ruin, your majesty, Vex said carefully. Ancient, powerful. The message claims she has already begun drawing on forces beyond anything our own royal mages have ever documented. Then she's more dangerous now than when we exiled her, Iris said quickly, and if there was a flicker of genuine fear beneath the concern in her voice, it was fear for herself, not for the crown, though nobody in the room was positioned to notice the distinction. Your Majesty, if she has power now, and she has every reason to want revenge. She has every reason, Aldrich said sharply, and something in his voice made Iris go very still. Because we gave her every reason, Lady Iris. Let us not pretend otherwise in private, whatever we maintain in public. It was the first time in 4 months the king had said anything even remotely close to doubt, and Iris filed the moment away with the same careful attention she filed everything else that might, eventually, need managing. Regardless, Vex said, smoothing over the sudden tension with the practiced ease of a career magistrate, the message offers a solution. This informant claims he can neutralize the threat for a price to be negotiated. What price? Aldrich asked. Vex consulted the missive again. A seat on the Royal Council, and full authority over the Crown's military response to whatever she's become. Aldrich was quiet for a long time, staring at nothing in particular, and Iris watched him with the careful, calculating patience of someone who had learned that the space just after a king's doubt, and just before his decision, was exactly where real power changed hands. Grant it, Aldrich said finally. Whatever this thing in the wastes is, I want it handled before it becomes my problem in a way I can no longer control. Neither the king nor his magistrate nor Lady Iris Hallow understood the true shape of the bargain they had just made, that they had in effect just invited the very man who had betrayed and imprisoned an archmage 3 centuries ago to walk directly into their court and do precisely the same thing to them. Only this time with a girl they had already made the fatal mistake of underestimating twice. 300 miles east in a chamber lit only by pale blue crystal, Seraphine Ashworth had just finished her 90th day of training in Valeth. Watching her complete a spell sequence that would have taken a court mage a decade to master allowed himself for the first time in 300 years something that felt dangerously close to hope. By the 120th day, Seraphine Ashworth had stopped counting the small losses. There had been more since her mother's name. The specific sound of her childhood nanny's laugh gone entirely, leaving only the abstract knowledge that it had once existed. 3 full years of memories from her youngest childhood blurred now into an impression rather than a story. The way a painting looks different once you've stood too close to it for too long. Vayleth had warned her, gently but honestly, each time she pushed toward a new tier of power, and each time Seraphine had made the same choice. "You could have told me to stop," she said one evening, sitting across from Vayleth's projected form near the deepest crystal vein, where the light ran a shade closer to violet than blue. "You've had 300 years to learn patience. You could have paced this out slower." "I could have," said Vayleth, "but Moraine Vieske is not pacing himself, Seraphine. And I would rather you lose pieces of your past than lose your entire future to a man who has already proven once that he would seal away anything he could not control. That's not comforting." "I am not here to comfort you," said Vayleth, though his tone, warmer now than it had been in the earliest days, suggested otherwise. "I am here to make certain you survive long enough to decide for yourself whether the cost was worth it." It was during this period that Seraphine began encountering other exiles. The wastes she had slowly come to understand were not the empty, lifeless expanse the Draymore court believed them to be, but a scattered network of the discarded, the banished, and the forgotten people who had built small, hidden communities out of the same stubborn refusal to simply lie down and die that had carried Seraphine through her own first weeks. The first she found was an old woman named Petra, once a royal healer exiled 20 years earlier for the crime of successfully treating a rival duke's illness that a jealous court physician had wanted to fail. Petra had built a small, fiercely self-sufficient settlement 30 miles south of Vayleth's ruin, and it was from Petra, not Vayleth, that Seraphine first learned something that changed the shape of everything. "You're not the only one the crown's thrown away, girl," Petra said, examining a shallow cut on Seraphine's forearm with the brisk, practiced hands of someone who had spent 40 years healing people the court no longer cared about. "There's near 200 of us scattered through these wastes now if you count every little settlement. Most of us didn't do a thing wrong except become inconvenient to someone with a crown or a title." 200, Seraphine repeated slowly. "And growing," Petra said. "Word travels, even out here, especially since that light of yours started lighting up the sky some nights. People are starting to whisper about a girl in the old ruin who might actually be able to do something about it one of these days." Seraphine sat with that for a long time after she left Petra's settlement, walking back through the frozen dark toward Vayleth's ruin, turning over an idea that had not, until this exact moment, occurred to her at all. "Vayleth," she said once she was back within the ruin's warm crystal halls, "I've been thinking about this wrong." "What do you mean?" "I've been thinking about revenge," she said slowly. "Just walking back in, showing them what I've become, making Iris and Callum and the king regret what they did to me. But that's small. That's just settling a personal score. And what would you prefer instead?" Seraphine looked up at the crystal veins running through the ancient stone, thinking of Petra's 40 years of quiet, unrewarded healing, of 200 exiles scattered through a wasteland the crown had decided to simply forget existed. "I want to build something," she said. "Not just tear down what they built. I want 200 people who have been thrown away to matter more than the throne that threw them away. I want it to be so undeniable that even Aldrich Draymore has to admit what he actually did." Vayleth's light warmed, slow and deep, in a way Seraphine had come to recognize over 4 months as something very close to pride. "That," he said quietly, "is the first thing you have said since your trial began that sounds less like vengeance and more like wisdom. It is also, I suspect, the only strategy with any real chance of surviving contact with Moraine Vieske, who will expect a lone girl seeking revenge, and will not know what to do with a leader building an army of the forgotten." It took another 6 weeks to organize what would eventually become known first quietly among the wastes, scattered exiles, and eventually terrifyingly throughout the entire Draymore court as the Ashen Accord, a loose alliance of every exile, every discarded healer, every disgraced soldier and forgotten scholar scattered through 300 miles of supposedly empty wasteland, bound together not by crowns or titles, but by the simple radical idea that they had all been thrown away by people who would eventually have to answer for it. Seraphine stood, on the day the Accord's first council gathered in Vayleth's outer hall, in front of nearly 60 representatives of settlements she had not known existed 4 months earlier, and felt, for the first time since the trial, something that was not grief or fear or fury but purpose. "They called me a traitor," she said, and her voice carried through the ancient stone hall with a clarity that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with finally believing what she was saying. "They called all of us traitors, criminals, inconveniences. But every single person in this hall survived something a king thought would kill them. We are not what they said we were. We are what's left after they tried to erase us, and I intend to make sure they never get to forget it." The hall erupted, and somewhere in that roar of 200 forgotten voices finally being heard, Seraphine Ashworth understood that she had stopped being simply the girl the throne room had condemned, and had started becoming something the Draymore court had never once imagined it would need to fear. 300 miles west Moraine Vesk received word of the Ashen Accord's first gathering with the same unhurried patient attention he gave everything, and for the first time in 300 years, allowed himself to consider that Vaelith's chosen apprentice might prove considerably more difficult to manage than a simple grieving girl seeking revenge. Moraine Vesk came to her alone, 3 weeks after the Ashen Accord's founding, walking openly through the wastes, frozen dark toward Vaelith's ruin with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once, in 300 years, felt the need to sneak toward anything he actually wanted. Seraphine felt him before Vaelith's warning even reached her, a wrongness in the crystal veins colder and older than the Hollow Knights had ever carried, and she met him at the ruin's outer threshold with her light blade already drawn though something in her. Some instinct she did not fully trust told her a fight was not in fact what he had come for. Lady Ashworth. Moraine Vesk's voice was exactly as dry and unhurried as she had somehow expected, a voice that had clearly not raised itself in genuine urgency for a very long time. Or perhaps I should say, Archmage's apprentice. "I understand congratulations are in order for your little accord." "You're Moraine Vesk," Seraphine said, not lowering her blade an inch. "The general who sealed my mentor into a crystal for 300 years. "I prefer the term visionary," Moraine said, entirely unbothered by the blade pointed at his chest. "Though I understand Vaelith has had 3 centuries to refine his version of events, and I don't imagine mine will land particularly well by comparison. Then why are you here?" "Because I have received an extremely generous offer from your former king," Moraine said, "and I wanted to extend you the same courtesy he extended me before I decide which offer is actually worth accepting." Seraphine's blade did not waver, but something in her chest went carefully, deliberately still. "What offer?" "Aldrich Draymore believes I am here to neutralize you," Moraine said, "in exchange for a seat on his council and full authority over his military. It is, I will admit, a generous offer for a king desperate enough to negotiate with the very man who once betrayed the archmage currently mentoring the girl he's trying to eliminate. Kings rarely notice the irony in their own bargains. And you're telling me this because I find myself, after 300 years, genuinely curious what you would offer instead," Moraine said. "Vaelith taught you well, clearly. You built an alliance out of exiles in a matter of weeks that took me decades to accomplish with far greater resources. I am not interested in serving a frightened king who will discard me the moment I am no longer useful, Lady Ashworth. I have already lived that particular story once, from the other direction. I would prefer this time to choose the winning side before the battle, rather than betray the losing one after it. You want to switch sides. I want to make an investment," Moraine corrected, "in whichever future actually survives what's coming. And I confess, watching you these past months, I am no longer entirely certain that future belongs to Aldrich Draymore." Seraphine studied him for a long moment, the ancient, unhurried patience in his face, the complete absence of the desperate urgency she had expected from a man 300 years overdue for a reckoning, and understood with sudden clarity exactly what Vaelith had tried to warn her about weeks earlier. "Vaelith told me you'd try this," she said. "He said you were persuasive, that you'd offer me revenge with no price attached." "Vaelith is not wrong often," Moraine said, "though I notice he has apparently failed to mention that I am in fact offering you a price. Quite a significant one. My knowledge of the Draymore court's every weakness, gathered over 3 centuries of patient observation, in exchange for a place in whatever you intend to build once you're finished burning down what currently exists. And if I say no, then I return to Aldrich Draymore," Moraine said simply, "and I help him destroy you and everything you've built here, because a 300-year-old man who has survived this long by choosing correctly does not survive by backing losing wagers out of sentiment." Seraphine lowered her blade slowly, though she did not sheath it entirely. "I need to think," she said. "Of course," Moraine said, already turning to leave, entirely unbothered, as though the outcome mattered to him considerably less than he had just spent several minutes implying. "Though I would think quickly, Lady Ashworth. Kings do not remain patient forever, and neither, I confess, do I. He was gone before she could ask anything further, vanishing back into the frozen dark with the same unhurried ease with which he had arrived. And Seraphine returned to Valeth's inner chamber to find the archmage's light burning low and troubled, having clearly overheard every word. "You knew he'd come," she said. "You knew he'd offer this." "I suspected," said Valeth. "What I did not expect was how genuinely uncertain he sounded. Moraine Vesk does not waste words on uncertainty, Seraphine. If he is truly considering switching sides, it means he believes genuinely that you might win. Do you think I should trust him?" "I think," said Valeth carefully, "that a man who betrayed me once will betray again the moment it serves him. But I also think that his knowledge of the Draymor court's weaknesses is genuine and considerable, and that refusing his offer outright simply hands that knowledge back to Aldric instead. Perhaps, Seraphine, the wisest choice is neither trust nor refusal." Seraphine considered this for a long moment, feeling the shape of a plan begin slowly to assemble itself in her mind, something patient, something strategic, something that used exactly the kind of careful, calculating maneuvering Moraine Vesk himself had spent 3 centuries perfecting. "Then I'll take his information," she said finally, "and I'll give him just enough trust to keep giving it to me. But I won't give him a seat at anything until I've seen exactly how far his loyalty actually bends before it breaks." Valeth's light warmed with something that was unmistakably approval. "Now," he said, "you are starting to think like someone who actually deserves to sit on a throne, rather than simply destroy one. 300 miles west Iris Hallow." Unaware that the very man the king had hired to eliminate her rival had just quietly begun weighing whether to betray them, all a second time stood before her own mirror practicing once again. The exact tremble of grief she would need to perform at the Queen's memorial banquet the following week, never once suspecting that the girl she had destroyed was at that very moment 4 months, and a lifetime away from ever needing to perform anything at all. Seraphine Ashworth returned to the Draymor court 7 months after her exile, and she did not come alone. Behind her walked 60 representatives of the Ashen Accord led by Petra the Healer and a former royal captain named Sir Tamsin Dove. Exiled 2 years earlier for the crime of refusing to falsify a battle report that would have covered up a nobleman's cowardice at the cost of 40 soldiers' lives. Beside her walked Moraine Vesk, whose loyalty she still did not fully trust, but whose information about the court's every hidden weakness had proven, over the preceding weeks, entirely accurate. And above her, visible from the border stone itself, a column of pale blue light, Valeth's power, fully hers now, though the cost of it had taken, among other things, the sound of her own childhood laughter, a memory she would never fully recover. She did not storm the throne room. That, she had decided weeks earlier, was exactly the kind of dramatic, satisfying gesture that would let Aldric Draymor frame her, once again, as a dangerous threat requiring immediate and forceful suppression. Instead, she requested, through entirely proper diplomatic channels, an audience, the same audience any returning noble might request, delivered with exquisite, deliberate politeness that unsettled the court far more than any threat could have. The throne room, when she finally entered it, was exactly as she remembered, the same candle wax and fear, the same gilded arrogance dressed up as tradition. Except this time Seraphine Ashworth walked in wearing not a stained gown, but a mantle of deep gray edged in pale blue crystal thread. And the entire court fell silent the moment she crossed the threshold, because the entire court had by now heard the rumors of the light in the eastern sky, and understood with the particular dread of people who have wronged someone and spent months hoping the wronging simply stayed buried. Exactly who was walking toward them? Lady Ashworth. King Aldric's voice, when he finally found it, carried none of the certainty it had held 7 months earlier. "You returned to us unannounced." "I returned to you," Seraphine said, her voice carrying through the hall with the same clarity she had learned addressing 60 gathered exiles in a broken ruin, "with a formal request for the crown to reopen the investigation into Queen Rosalind's poisoning. I have new evidence." A murmur swept the gallery. Somewhere near the throne, Seraphine watched Iris Hallow go very, very still. "New evidence," Aldric repeated slowly. "Testimony," Seraphine said, "from a kitchen servant dismissed quietly the week after my exile and paid a sum of money considerably larger than her position would typically warrant to leave the capital and never return. My associates found her 3 weeks ago in a village 200 miles south. She was, it turns out, quite willing to speak, once she understood she was no longer required to protect the people who had paid her silence." Moraine Vesk, standing quietly behind her, had located that servant in 4 days, using knowledge of the court's hidden financial trails that 3 centuries of patient observation had made almost effortless. "This is absurd," Iris said quickly, stepping forward before the king could respond, her voice pitched with exactly the trembling outrage she had once used so effectively at Seraphine's trial. Your Majesty, surely you don't intend to reopen a settled matter based on the word of some dismissed servant. I would think, Seraphine said, turning to look at Iris directly for the first time in 7 months, and something in her voice made even Iris falter mid-sentence, that a woman with nothing to hide would welcome a full investigation rather than argue so urgently against one. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Seraphine had heard in months. Bring the servant forward, Aldrich said finally, and his voice had gone tight, careful, the voice of a man beginning, for the first time, to genuinely doubt a story he had accepted 7 months earlier because doubting it would have been politically inconvenient. The servant's testimony delivered with quiet, unhurried clarity in front of the entire gathered court confirmed everything Seraphine had suspected since the moment she saw Iris's half-second flicker of satisfaction 7 months earlier, that Iris Hallow had paid for the Nightbell essence herself. That she had planted it in Seraphine's chambers the same night she claimed to have witnessed Seraphine near the kitchens, and that she had done all of it not out of any genuine belief in Seraphine's guilt, but because Prince Callum had months earlier quietly confided to Iris that he no longer wished to marry a woman his father had chosen for him, and Iris had simply decided to remove the obstacle standing between herself and the crown she had always secretly wanted far more than she had ever wanted Seraphine's friendship. You didn't even do it for love, Seraphine said quietly, once the servant had finished, watching Iris's careful composure finally completely crack. You did it for a title. You don't understand what it's like, Iris said, and her voice, for the first time in 7 months, carried something that was not performance at all. Watching you have everything, the title, the betrothal. The love of a queen who taught you star charts when you were 11, and knowing none of it was ever going to be mine no matter how hard I tried, because I was born a lesser house and you were. So you decided the solution was to make sure I lost everything instead, Seraphine said, rather than simply building something of your own. Iris had no answer for that because there wasn't one. And the silence that followed told the entire gathered court everything it needed to understand about exactly what kind of woman had been standing at the king's side for 7 months, weeping false tears over a queen she had helped condemn an innocent girl for poisoning. King Aldrich Draymore looked for a long moment between Iris Hallow's shattered composure and Seraphine Ashworth's quiet, unshaking calm, and understood, finally, exactly what his own desperate need for a convenient, tidy resolution had cost an innocent girl 7 months earlier. Lady Hallow, he said slowly, will be held for formal trial on charges of regicide by proxy and conspiracy against the crown. Iris did not scream or beg or protest. She simply stood there, utterly still, as the guards who had once escorted Seraphine to her exile now moved to take Iris in her place, and Seraphine, watching her former friend led away, felt none of the triumphant satisfaction she had spent 7 months imagining she would feel. She felt instead something that surprised her far more, a quiet, exhausted sorrow for the girl who had once carved sisters before crowns into an oak tree behind the Ashworth stables, and who had chosen somewhere along the way to become someone who no longer remembered what that promise had ever meant. But there was still one more conversation left to have, and Prince Callum Draymore was still standing near the throne, having not yet said a single word. You knew, Seraphine said, turning finally to Callum, who had stood in silence through the entire proceeding, his face pale, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back that his knuckles had gone white. Not everything. But you knew something was wrong that night, and you chose to say nothing, because saying something would have cost you a marriage you'd already decided you didn't want. Seraphine. Don't, she said, and it was not sharp exactly, but it carried a finality that silenced him more effectively than any shout could have. I spent 7 months in a wasteland. Everyone told me nothing survived, Callum. I lost my mother's name. I lost the sound of my own childhood laughter. I lost pieces of myself I will never get back, because the 2 people I trusted most in this world decided my life mattered less than their own convenience. I don't need you to apologize. I need you to understand that I am not the same girl who used to wait for you by the fountain, and I never will be again. Callum's composure finally broke, and for a moment standing there in front of the entire court, he looked less like a prince and more like the boy who had once climbed an orchard wall to bring her stolen peaches. I was afraid, he said quietly. Iris told me she made it sound so certain, and I was a coward, and I let my fear decide for me instead of my faith in you, and I have regretted it every single day since. I believe that you regret it, Seraphine said. I don't believe regret undoes what it cost me. You don't have to be punished the way Iris will be. You didn't plan this, you only failed to stop it. But you also don't get my forgiveness simply because you've finally decided to say the words out loud, 7 months too late for them to mean what they might have meant that night. She turned then to King Aldrich, who had watched the entire exchange with the particular stillness of a man finally understanding the true size of the mistake he had made. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice, when she addressed the throne directly, carried none of the deference it once had, not disrespect exactly, but the calm, unshakable confidence of someone who no longer needed a king's approval to know her own worth. "I am not here to take your throne. I have built something in the wastes you called Forsaken, an alliance of nearly 200 people your court discarded, who now govern themselves more fairly than this court has ever governed anyone. I would ask that the Crown formally recognize the Ashen Accord as a sovereign territory, under my governance, with full diplomatic standing." The gallery erupted into murmurs, and Aldrich staring at the girl he had exiled 7 months earlier. Now standing before him with an army of the Forgotten at her back, and a power in her veins older than his own crown, understood that he was no longer in any position to refuse. "Granted," he said finally, quietly, and something in the single word carried the full weight of 7 months of guilt he had never once allowed himself to feel until this exact moment. Seraphine nodded once formally and turned to leave, but paused at the threshold of the throne room and looked back one final time. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't hate you, Your Majesty. I think you made a frightened, convenient choice, the same way most people do when the truth is inconvenient and the lie is easy. I hope you spend the rest of your reign remembering exactly what that choice cost, and choosing differently the next time someone stands in front of you asking only to be believed." She left the throne room without waiting for a response. Walking out into the courtyard where Sir Tamsin Dove and Petra and 60 representatives of the Ashen Accord waited for her, and where just beyond them Moraine Vesk stood with the careful, unreadable patience of a man still deciding even now exactly how far his own loyalty actually extended. Valeth's voice, warm now, entirely free of the thunderous grandeur he had carried in their earliest days together, spoke quietly in the space only she could hear. "You did not burn it down," he said. "You built something better and made them watch." "I lost so much to get here," Seraphine said quietly, looking out at the small, stubborn army of the Forgotten who had chosen to follow her home. "My mother's name, my own laughter, pieces of myself I'll never get back. And what did you gain in their place?" Seraphine looked at Petra, who had spent 40 years healing people nobody else would treat. She looked at Sir Tamsin Dove, who had refused to lie even when the truth cost him everything. She looked at the pale blue light still glowing faintly beneath her own skin, 300 years of forgotten power finally awake and finally entirely her own. "A family I chose," she said, "instead of one that was simply handed to me. And the knowledge that whatever I lost, I never once lost myself." The Ashen Accord governed its territory in the wastes for the following 40 years in history, real history this time. Not the rewritten kind Moraine Vesk had once specialized in, would remember Seraphine Ashworth not as the villainess a frightened court had once condemned her to be, but as the woman who took everything a kingdom threw away and built from the ashes of it. Something the kingdom itself eventually came to envy. She never did remember her mother's name. But she remembered, every single day for the rest of her long life, exactly what it had cost to become someone worth remembering, and she made absolutely certain that every person who had once called her forsaken lived long enough to watch her prove them wrong.